Good morning. I'm Kate Schaefers, and I'm director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's talk, which is part of our 2023 Great Decisions series. Our speaker today is Gary Prevost, and our topic is Politics in Latin America. So a little bit about our speaker today. Gary Prevost is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Latin American Studies at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. Professor Prevost has been researching and writing about Latin America for more than 40 years. He's also traveled extensively in the region. He is author and editor of numerous books and articles on Latin American politics. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship between Ramsey County Library, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota, Global Minnesota, and the Foreign Policy Association. And we are deeply grateful to all of these organizations for their support in bringing these talks to our communities. Now I'll turn things over to our speaker, Professor Gary Prevost. Professor, thank you so much for being here today.
Glad to do this. I want to be clear that the focal point of today's presentation is politics in Latin America. It is not primarily a talk about United States-Latin American relations. Those kind of questions may come up in relation to this talk, and I'm willing to deal with them during the question and answer period. When I began studying Latin America as an undergraduate in the late 1960s, the focal point of studying Latin America was the fact that the great majority of the Latin American countries were under military rule by that time. There were exceptions. Venezuela and Colombia remained under civilian rule, and there were long-standing and seemingly vibrant democracies in Chile and in Uruguay. But by 1973, in those latter two countries, military coups had taken over. And even where there were democracies in Latin America, beginning in the early part of the 20th century, they were very limited democracies with limited voting rights for the poor majority. And until well into the 20th century, only men voted. The elections were contested by mainstream conservative parties that often, in the cases of Colombia and Venezuela, traded political power. But there was little room for really progressive parties of the left to thrive. However, the conditions to change that began in the 1960s and onward, when resistance developed one by one to the military rule that was happening. And as a result, Latin America made a strong shift in the 1980s toward democratic rule. Argentina's military dictatorship ended in 1983, Brazil's ended in 1985, and Chile's ended in 1989. What initially occurred, military rule was discredited, but the politics of the region returned to the domination by the mainstream conservative parties that represented the same business and financial elites who had been comfortable with military rule. And they carried out, in the period of the 1980s and into the early 90s, they carried out conservative policies of limited government, and with few programs aimed at the majority poor and the deep inequalities that the region had inherited from the colonial past. Indigenous people, Afro-descendant people in particular, were marginalized, often denied the right to vote in many of the countries. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European socialist governments at the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s, the left, again, seemingly did not have a path to power, as socialism seemed to be in decline worldwide. For example, Inácio da Silva, Lula, was poised to win the presidential election in Brazil in the fall of 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell and the discrediting of socialism in the eyes of many, and he was defeated in that election. But the policies that these conservative governments pursued in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that promised that they would bring prosperity to all, simply did not deliver. And poverty actually deepened even as the economies grew, but the failure of their trickle-down economic model was becoming clearer and clearer to the population. And so you began to have the mobilization in the decade of the 90s of indigenous people, Afro-descendants, the landless people, the urban poor, began to demand a role in the region's politics. And that came to fruition in one of the countries that had remained, as I said, a democratically elected government country throughout the region, and that was Venezuela, where in the 1998 election, a former army officer, Hugo Chavez, running on a platform of challenging the existing two major parties, a Christian Democratic Party and a Social Democratic Party, which had both pursued conservative austerity programs in the period leading up to 1998. He basically said, we need to throw out those parties and start anew and begin an orientation of Venezuelan politics in a more radical direction, to aim it toward the needs of the majority of the population. He won in a landslide, 56% of the vote. The other two traditional parties lost most of their support. And once in power, Chavez moved quickly to deliver on his promises. He reformed the Constitution in a way that gave much more power to the government to enact social welfare programs. He made a particular emphasis on reducing poverty by improving health care, by improving education. And he did so by taking full control of the government's ownership of the oil. It had been owned by the government, but with most of the royalties flowing outside of the country, he was now able to reorient that revenue toward these social programs. And fairly soon, he also made links with Cuba and with Fidel Castro. And he did that as he was declaring now that Venezuela was going to pursue what he called 21st century socialism, based on winning democratic elections and using those democratic elections to change the lives of the majority of the people. In a way, he was going back to the playbook of social democrats way back to the 19th century, the idea that you could bring socialism through the ballot box and use the levers of government power to improve the lives of people. And with the Cuban cooperation, who provided doctors and educators and other technical people to support his efforts, Venezuela quickly became a success story in terms of the reduction of poverty. It didn't stop there. Chavez's victory in 1998 was followed 4 years later by the election of Lula Inácio da Silva and the Workers' Party, a avowedly and openly socialist party with social democratic politics, with a very similar bent to Chavez, using the country's resources to benefit the majority poor. He won the 2002 election in a landslide and established a set of social welfare programs built around both education and healthcare and direct poverty reduction. His signature program was Zero Hunger, a program of direct subsidies to poor families with the proviso that they keep their children in school. So it was a combination of raising the education level of the population while providing direct subsidies to the poor so that they could purchase food and end the malnutrition, which had been so common in so much of the poorer parts of the Brazilian nation. The programs were generally successful, helped to reduce poverty, reduce hunger, raise education levels, and the voters in Brazil rewarded him. He was reelected in a landslide in 2006. Like in the United States, he was term limited, but his chosen successor, Dilma Rousseff of the Workers' Party, also again won elections in 2010 and in 2014. Chile was another important country where politics was changing. In the immediate wake of the end of the dictatorship in 1989, the Chilean people had chosen the right of center Christian Democrats to rule them for a number of years. But in the new century, in the 21st century, they turned to the Socialist Party of Michelle Bachelet, a social democratic party that was arguing that Chile, with its considerable copper wealth and its long-standing positive business model, could afford to do more for the country's poorer population. And in the process, the Socialist Party initiated a set of social reforms, drawing on the legacy of their socialist predecessor, Salvador Allende, who had been overthrown in a military coup in 1973 for attempting just such the same programs. But by this time, there was no danger that the military would intervene, as the military had long been discredited. In the other major country in the Southern Cone, Argentina, the same thing was happening there. A move definitively toward the left. There it was interesting. It was the transformation of the existing ruling party, the Justice Party, which had ruled the country since the return of democracy and had ruled it in earlier periods of democracy in the country. There, a couple, Nestor and Christina Kirchner, charismatic, especially Christina, basically aligned themselves with the other moves to the left that were happening in the continent, and committed themselves in multiple elections to improving the lot of the poor majority, and also coming to account for the military dictatorship that had ruled the country and had disappeared so many people back in the 1970s. And they were able to win multiple elections from 2002 forward. Similar electoral successes under the banner of socialism, I won't go into the details, occurred in Uruguay after its return to democracy, in Bolivia, a country that had long been ruled mostly by the military and with very elite rule there. A movement towards socialism of Evo Morales was able, after massive street demonstrations, forced a conservative government out, was able to sweep to power in multiple elections. Similar movement called the Citizens' Revolution occurred in Ecuador under the leadership of an economist by the name of Rafael Correa. And in Nicaragua, where the Sandinista revolution had seemingly ended in 1990 with their electoral defeat by conservatives, who then proceeded to win 4 consecutive elections. In 2006, Ortega's Sandinista party returned to power and have remained in power ever since. The only countries that were therefore not taken up, if you will, in this pink tide of left electoral victories were Peru, Colombia, and Mexico, which in that era remained with conservative leaders. Now, boosting the fortunes of these parties of the left as they came to power and implemented their social welfare programs, most of which had not previously existed, or if they had, they were able to fund them to a much greater level. They benefited from a time early in the 21st century, of high commodity prices, with major sales to a resurgent China, thirsty both for foodstuffs and raw materials. However, there were, right from even in the midst of their electoral victories in this era from 2000 roughly to 2014, there were factors that were undermining their potential long-term success. Countries like Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Chile, and to a degree Brazil and Argentina were dependent on the inherited, long-established economic model of their country, which was based more on commodity production than on manufacturing. And while these progressives saw the need to diversify their economies and become more oriented toward the more solid base of manufacturing, that is not something that governments were easily able to do, especially since, again, these remained generally economies that were run by the private sector, which did its business the way that it always had. And then the 2008-9 economic crisis, right in the middle of this pink tide, undercut their ability to deliver the social programs because the commodity prices fell and their revenue stream was sharply reduced. In all of these countries, there's never been a tradition of the rich paying their fair share of taxes. So there's really not been a progressive income tax system that might be a source of revenue independent of the state ownership of resources. The old conservative forces that suddenly lost political power after decades were not without many cards to play. One of the cards that they were able to play and continue to play today in 2023 is that the private media, especially television, dominate in Latin America, not state-owned television that is under the control of a ruling party, but private media. And the private media in Latin America, since it's connected to the longstanding elites, financial and otherwise, they are opposed definitively to the rule by these parties of the left. And so they will consistently tilt their media coverage to put the governments in as weak and bad a light as possible. The conservative forces were also able to use the judiciary because these forces had appointed and placed in power over the course of decades leading into the left electoral victories, judges who were very much politically aligned with them. And so a pattern developed, especially in Brazil, of the conservative judges of the old order bringing up questionable corruption charges against the left leaders. In particular, they targeted Inácio da Silva, Lula, and ultimately succeeded in getting him in jail to the point where when it was his turn to run again for president in 2018, he was disqualified from the ballot because he was in jail. The charges against him would eventually be dropped because they were of a questionable character, and he was actually able to return to political life and, as I'll state later, win the 2022 presidential election. Another interesting card that the politically conservative forces are able to play in Latin America, and I think an American audience understands this to a degree, is the question of the evangelicals. You may think of Latin America as a primarily Catholic continent, and that has been traditionally true going all the way back to Spanish colonialism. But one of the interesting developments of the last 40 years in Latin America has been a strong growth of the evangelicals, a strong growth of this segment of the society. In the Central American countries like Costa Rica and Guatemala, it has reached virtual majority status. And these evangelical groups, while they do have upper class people within them, generally are drawn from the region's poor majority. And while that poor majority, in fact, benefits directly from the policies of the governments of the left also tend to take progressive positions on issues related to sexual orientation, related to abortion. And as a result, the evangelicals are mobilized in union with conservative Catholic forces to oppose these governments of the left, not on the basis of their social programs, but on the basis of the stance that they take on these gender issues that are close to the heart of evangelical voters. This has been especially true in elections in Colombia, in Brazil, in Chile, and in a few other locations. This combination of factors that were working against the pick tide came to a head in 2015, when in Argentina you had the first major defeat of a party of the left. Admittedly, Cristina Fernandez was disqualified from running by term limits, and her husband had passed away. And so they had to turn to another candidate, a lesser known candidate, without the charisma and particular appeal of Cristina. And the result, combined with a number of other factors, was that a conservative, Mauricio Macri, was able to win the 2015 election in Argentina and seemingly begin to stem the pink tide. That continued with some very strange developments that occurred in Brazil the following year, 2016. Dilma Rousseff was in the middle of her second term as Workers' Party president when her conservative, middle-of-the-road allies decided to abandon her. In her election campaign in 2014, she had to turn to them to guarantee her electoral victory. But when they abandoned support for her in the Congress, they moved to impeach her on questionable grounds. But they had the votes to do so by linking up with the conservative forces and isolating the Workers' Party in Congress. And they were able to put the vice president in power, and the vice president was of that conservative middle of the road party. And so suddenly you had, now in 2015 and now 2016, you had the two largest countries in the Southern Cone, Brazil and Argentina, now governed by political conservatives. And that would lead, in the case of Brazil, going forward to the 2018 election, where, again, as I noted earlier, Lula was in jail, and his handpicked successor, a man by the name of Haddad, simply did not have the kind of charisma and character that Lula himself had. And the result was that in the 2018 election, the political march to the right continued with the victory of a far-right candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, a man who actually, during the campaign, showed admiration for military rule in earlier decades in the country, and styled himself as a kind of Trump populist who would continue some of the social welfare programs of the Workers' Party government, but would overall take the country in a much more conservative direction. And he was able to win the 2018 election. And to complete this Southern Cone picture, in 2017 in Chile, the Socialist Party string of victories was ended when a conservative, Sebastian Piñera, was able to win the presidency. And even in a case where the left seemed to triumph, in Ecuador, where Rafael Correa was not allowed to run due to term limits, his handpicked successor, Lenin Moreno, won the election, seemingly continuing the control of Ecuadorian politics by the left. But once in power, Lenin Moreno, sort of reading the winds of the continent as a whole, made the declaration that he was renouncing the policies of his socialist predecessor, and that he would move Ecuador in a neoliberal direction. In that era, there was also in Bolivia, where a close election that was apparently won by the MAS, the Movement Towards Socialism, Morales's party, was prevented from taking office by the first significant military coup to occur in the region in decades. So at that point, in many ways, and to many people, the pink tide was over. The rule of the left in Latin America was dramatically coming to an end. But the reality was that the governments of the right who took over, whether it was in Brazil, Argentina especially, Chile, Bolivia, the governments, again, not unlike the early 90s, that promised prosperity under their conservative economic policies, did not deliver at all. And very quickly, resistance to these governments in street demonstrations underscored that their time in office might in fact be short-lived. The beginning of a new wave of electoral victories from the left began in an unlikely place, Mexico. where in 2018, Manuel López Obrador, who had lost a close election in 2006, was able to create a new political party called Morena, an avowedly social democratic party promising significant reforms in the Mexican socioeconomic system, to speak to the needs of Mexico's majority poor, was able to win easily. And not just the presidency, but his brand new political party also took control of the Mexican parliament, giving López Obrador the opportunity in the ensuing years, he remains president through until a new election next year, to pursue this progressive agenda. The new wave continued the next year when Mauricio Macri ran for re-election in Argentina and was defeated. By now, Cristina Fernandez was able to come back into the picture. She came in as the vice presidential candidate under a hand-picked presidential candidate by the name of Fernandez, but no relation. And they were able, pointing out that Macri had promised to speak to the needs of the majority of Argentinians, but had really failed to do so with his conservative economic policies. They were able to win back control of both the presidency and the Argentinian Congress. And once in power, they successfully negotiated a deal with the International Monetary Fund that freed up money to begin to restore the social welfare programs and social safety net that had been eroded in the years of Macri. The new wave continued in 2021 when in Chile, Sebastián Piñera's attempt to win a second term failed spectacularly when a young socialist leader, Gabriel Boric, man in his 30s, and emerging from student demonstrations that had challenged Piñera's hold on power and his policies during his 4 years in power, was able to win the presidency of the country by a wide margin. In the same year, there was also a seemingly significant victory that ultimately did not fully consolidate. I mentioned that one of the countries which had never gone to the left during the pink tide had been Peru. But in the election of 2022, Pedro Castillo, a peasant leader, former teacher, running on a openly socialist platform, won the presidency of the country by a very, very narrow margin. But he did not win control of the Congress, which remained in the hands of conservative forces, and he would eventually be impeached. And in spite of massive street demonstrations and violent clashes with the police, he was placed in jail, where he remains today, in spite of having won the presidential election just 2 years ago. It was again a reminder of the knife edge in some cases in which politics in the region lies between the left and the right. 2022 then saw maybe the most consequential electoral victory of this era, of this new wave. As I mentioned, Colombia, again, had been a country where the left had never succeeded in taking power. But in 2022, an avowedly socialist candidate, Gustavo Petro, who had been defeated in the election 4 years earlier, was able to surge to the front and win the presidency of Colombia with strong backing from the indigenous communities and the Afro-descendant communities, including one of them being his vice presidential candidate. And this happened in part because Colombia finally had achieved a settlement to its long-standing civil war in 2016 that made more normal politics possible. And while the 2018 election didn't produce a candidate of the left, by 2022, the country was clearly ready for a candidate of the left. However, Petro, in his now more than a year in power, has faced challenges because his new political party did not win a majority of seats in the Congress. It's a strong party, but he must negotiate with and work with parties of the political center and right in order to push through his progressive agenda. The run of electoral victories continued at the end of 2022 in a rematch in Brazil between Inácio da Silva, Lula, who now freed of the corruption charges and back in the political arena, was able to run against the incumbent Jair Bolsonaro, the conservative Trump-like candidate. And in a very close, narrow election with the evangelicals strongly supporting Jair Bolsonaro and in their large numbers in that country, Lula was able to win the presidency, 51% to 49%. But not unlike Petro in Colombia, he does not have a working majority in Congress. In fact, the largest single party in the Brazilian Congress is Jair Bolsonaro's Liberal Party. So there are challenges for Lula to continue his agenda in that country, though to some degree it was helped by the fact that Bolsonaro, as this populist in some ways, had continued some of the social welfare programs that Lula had initiated during his time in office. And finally, just one more note on the electoral front. In this year, 2023, there have been relatively few elections, but there was an important consequential one within the last few weeks in Guatemala, another country which had never previously elected a candidate of the left. But there, a candidate by the name of Arvelo, who is the son of a popular progressive leader from decades ago, won the presidency in an upset over traditional conservative candidates. However, it's interesting there, those conservative forces have made efforts to disqualify him, even though he won a clear victory. He declared in a speech here in the last couple of days that there might be a soft coup to prevent him from taking power. But the trend back to the left and toward progressive governments has clearly been there. It's not to say that because of the longstanding challenges these governments have to change the character of their economies, to be able to afford the social justice programs that they espouse. Changes, I think, have been made permanent in some ways in Latin America. It is now, unlike 40 years ago and before, it has now been well established that there is a key role for government and government programs of a social welfare nature to be present, to basically undergird the population, to support the population during the ups and downs of the inevitable capitalist business cycles. It's the fact that most of the candidates of the right, when they run, are now forced to say that even though they never supported such programs, they would continue them because they've become popular among the voters, and therefore they know that they need to support these programs. Also, the various governments of the left have also made it quite a universal view among governments in Latin America that they should control their country's natural resources, that these resources should not be owned by foreign conglomerates, which had, for example, been the case in Bolivia when the movement towards socialism government of Evo Morales took power in 2005. They moved to nationalize and take control of those resources, including the very important one of today, lithium. So I think that's now also well established, that even when governments of the right might come to power, that the idea of privatizing and selling to foreign interests the country's natural resources is not is simply not politically acceptable. But the left, there's no guarantee that these parties of the left can continue without that longer-term need to break from the cycle of dependency on commodity prices worldwide, which inevitably go up and down, and the ability to create taxation systems that truly are progressive and can tap the wealth of the richer elements of society. Most of these governments of the left have yet successfully to tackle that, and so to some degree they remain vulnerable to these inevitable cycles of lower and higher commodity prices. I will leave it there, and will be glad to take any of your questions about any aspect of what I've talked about. And if you wish to bring in conversations about the role of the United States and U.S. foreign policy in the region, I'd also be open to questions along those lines.
Thank you, Gary, for a very informative talk, and we are getting some terrific questions. Please keep them coming. I'd like to start with a question that Sue asked. Where does the term Latin America come from, and do countries in the region identify with this term?
It's a long-standing term that whose origin is actually a little bit, in a sense, almost a little bit obscure. It goes back to the era of the colonization of the region. Basically, it goes back to the period of the colonization of the region and the division by the Pope of the time back in the 16th century of dividing the region between the Portuguese and Spanish colonizers, whereby the Portuguese got the, if you will, the big prize of Brazil, and the Spanish got the rest of it. The term we sometimes more broadly use actually is Latin America and the Caribbean, because if we are to include the entire region, then you have the English-speaking colonies, islands, Jamaica and others in the Caribbean region that are there. But it's a term that we've come to use over a long period of time, and of course the continent of the South, below Panama from Colombia and south, we refer to South America, and the Central American region then from Panama through to Guatemala, and then of course the North American part with Mexico, the United States, and Canada.
Mm-hmm. And we have a couple of questions about alliances. Richard asked specifically between 2000 and 2014, while we were going through, all these countries were going through transformation, was there cooperation or mutual efforts between these countries? And then taking it another level, someone asked specifically about Brazil, and did they identify with the region, or were they aligning beyond the continent?
Great question. I did in order to make sure that I got my remarks completed within the first half, I did actually leave out some things that I could have said. Yes, alliances, very important. The governments, the conservative governments that had been in power for decades, were very comfortable with the framework of the Western Hemisphere that was set up by the United States beginning at the end of the 19th century with what was called the Pan American Union, and then after World War II with the Organization of American States and a separate military treaty called the Rio Pact. Especially the Organization of American States, based in Washington and seemingly then dominated by Washington, was not acceptable to the governments of the left. And Hugo Chavez and Lula, each in their own ways as heads of Venezuela and Brazil, began to challenge that domination. One of their first acts was to prevent a further integration of Latin America and the Caribbean with the United States in the form of the free trade area of the Americas, a project which had been launched during the George H.W. Bush administration and then was being driven to a conclusion by Bill Clinton through a summit in Miami in 1994, when the region still had all conservative leaders. That project would have sort of been another piece of a U.S. domination of the region. And so one of the first steps that Lula and Chavez took was to block the implementation of the free trade area of the Americas. They did so at a meeting in Argentina in Mar del Plata. I was present in the city during that meeting, where basically Lula and Chavez and several other progressive Latin American leaders said to then President George W. Bush that this project, which had been in the works for a decade, was not going to go forward. In addition, they set up their own organizations, 3 of them. The Bolivarian Alternative, which is an alliance that began with bilateral relations between Venezuela and Cuba to exchange human capital, if you will, teachers and doctors for oil revenue, was expanded and included Bolivia, included Ecuador, included Nicaragua, included many of the Caribbean islands, became a part of this Bolivarian Alternative. And that organization continues to exist, though the economic challenges that Venezuela has faced in the post-Chavez era under economic sanctions and from the United States have limited the capacity of that particular organization. Another one that was spurred mostly by Brazil was the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR. And it was an effort to bring together all of the South American countries and link up the existing free trade agreements that they had into a single agreement. Because there's an agreement, a kind of European Union style economic agreement that links Brazil with Argentina and Uruguay, that goes back to the conservative government era, but that's been embraced by the progressive governments. So UNASUR was a project of the Brazilians. Interestingly, when Bolsonaro took power, it was shelved. But now that Lula is back in power, he's pressing for its return. And then there's also the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations, CELAC, which was initiated actually out of Mexico, from a government that was actually quite friendly to the United States of Vicente Fox, but which sought to create some distance from the United States, because all three of these alliances, all three of them, did not include the United States, quite pointedly. All three did not include the United States. They were efforts at what they called autonomous Latin American integration. And they've had their ups and their downs, because there are, both ideological and economic differences that exist among the Latin American countries. Brazil, just to complete it, is in a position, it's the biggest country, biggest economy, and it's long not been exclusively dependent on the United States economic market. It's long had economic relations with Europe, and then they were one of the key countries that really established in the last 25 years economic relations with China, so that they seek to balance their economic relations among the three major economic blocs in the world: the United States, the European Union, and the People's Republic of China.
And I have a couple of questions that are great follow-ups to that. Lori was asking about China and its involvement in South America. And in your opinion, is this seen more positively by the population there than the involvement with the US had been?
That's an interesting question, because I think that in practical terms, the Chinese involvement in Latin America has grown exponentially over the last 30 years. Mainly, and not with, to be honest, a lot of kind of direct impact on the populace. What it's meant is that the governments of the region have found China to be an important market. And vice versa. China has found Latin America to be a very important market, purchasing large amounts of wheat from Argentina, soybeans from Brazil, copper from Chile, iron ore from Peru, to name a few. And that is given a diversification to these countries' economies that they welcome, even as they almost always continue very important economic relations with the United States that are long-standing and based on U.S. transnational corporations that are fully active in these Latin American countries. Because you have to remember that these parties of the left that have taken power have continued to basically support the capitalist economic system. They've not moved to nationalize, other than energy companies, they've not moved to nationalize any other businesses, and they welcome business with everyone. Now, China has also signed agreements in its Belt and Road Initiative to provide long-term loans for the construction of infrastructure projects in the region. They've built soccer stadiums. They've built railroads, they've built roads. Most of the projects are geared toward, if you will, Chinese interests, in the sense that they make it easier for the raw materials to make their way efficiently to the People's Republic of China. And, governments in the region have been careful and skeptical with some of these projects, not wanting to get into the so-called debt trap of being unable to ultimately pay back long-term loans. But the reality has been that up until now, there simply was not the kind of financing coming from the Inter-American Development Bank out of Washington or of USAID directly from the US government to provide the kind of monies that China has been willing to provide. The Biden administration has said and has made some efforts to counter that as part of its wider foreign policy challenge to the Chinese. But it's yet to be seen whether, especially Congress, has the appetite for the kind of monies that might be needed from in that regard. Clearly, ironically, both governments of the left and the right have dealt with China and have continued their economic relations with them. In other words, when Bolsonaro came in Brazil, or Piñera in Chile, it didn't mean that suddenly they walked away from economic relations with the PRC. That was kind of baked into the economies of their countries. Lula did make, once he came back in, he made a special effort to link up with China, made a trip there with huge coterie of Brazilian business people to expand relations with China. And on a political level, through the organization called BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, Lula has taken the lead with China in calling for a new international economic order, wishing to get out from underneath the domination of the world economy by the dollar that comes from both Europe and the United States. So that's another aspect to, at least the left in Latin America, willing to work with China to try to level the international playing field away from the United States.
So here's a question. Venezuela has been referred to as a failed state. And can you explain what the current situation is and why it is this state?
Yeah, Venezuela is a very, very complex and in many ways troubling situation as it developed, because we're now 25 years into the Bolivarian revolution initiated with the electoral victory of Hugo Chavez back in 1998. And there's no question but that over the course of the time that Chavez was in power, before he passed from cancer in 2013 and power transferred to his handpicked successor, Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela made many significant strides in its social welfare development programs, in education, in healthcare, reducing poverty, reducing malnutrition. All those things can be documented by the statistics of the United Nations and in the progress that they were making in the Millennium Development Goals. But Chavez was always a thorn in the side of the United States by being a key person in sabotaging the free trade area of the Americas. And in general, leading the Bolivarian alternative and other efforts that called out the United States in very, very negative terms, and setting, if you will, an example of trying to pursue what he called 21st century socialism, and he did it in open alliance with a longstanding U.S. adversary in Cuba. And so it was inevitable, one might argue, that he came in the crosshairs of U.S. administrations, both Democrat and Republican. And so by the period of 2010 and onward, United States embarked on a program of economic sanctions against Venezuela that were aimed at wrecking the Venezuelan economy. And in recent studies that have been done now, a decade or so on from the beginning of those sanctions, what some will call economic warfare, they have had their intended consequence. They have succeeded in greatly damaging the Venezuelan economy. It's not to say that some of the projects that the Venezuelans themselves pursued to try to diversify their economy were not successful. But the main takeaway from the recent reports that have been published verify that it has been this economic warfare against Venezuela that has so devastated the Venezuelan economy. And that resulted then, within the last 5 years, in an exodus of Venezuelans. They went not initially toward the United States. They went in the direction of Colombia and Ecuador and Peru, given the barrier, if you will, that is the Darien Gap, the jungle with no road that exists between Colombia and Panama that makes the travel to the United States much more difficult. But these sanctions have, there's no question, they have devastated the economy. They have made it difficult for Venezuela to do business in the international economy. They've come up with ways to survive by making linkages with countries like Iran, maintaining good relations with Russia and with China. But that, of course, then only deepens the enmity toward them from Washington. And that's the current situation. And why we are now feeling it in the United States is the following happened. When the COVID-19 pandemic came in 2020-21 and devastated the economies in many ways of Latin America, including Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, where the Venezuelans had gone, their ability to stay there and to find viable work and make a living was severely damaged. And so they began, with the help of the development of a smuggler network in the Darien Gap, they began to seek to come to the United States. And in their hundreds of thousands, over the course of the last 2 years, they have made their way to the United States, and have either come into the United States surreptitiously or have presented themselves at the border seeking political asylum. And the result is that there are now hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans, including 100,000 Venezuelans in New York City alone at this point, that are very much fueling the migration crisis that is challenging the U.S. government at this very moment. The Obama administration, for example, while it made an opening in 2014, a long-awaited opening toward Cuba to normalize relations and to begin to lessen the sanctions against the Cubans, that was never done. The Obama administration never did that again during its time in office, and the Trump administration deepened the sanctions and even attempted, there was an attempted coup with mercenaries against the Venezuelan government that occurred during the Trump time period. So that's the Venezuelan situation. It is in many ways a very sad tale because of the damage that's been done to the Venezuelan reasonable project of social justice by the governments of the United States, both Democrat and Republican.
So what role have the cartels played in some of this mass migration?
Well, it varies country to country. If we're speaking of the cartels, it's the question of the drug traffic and its role in various countries. It obviously is the cocaine had traditionally come from Colombia and made its way eventually through Mexico. And so Mexico became, in the last 10 years, really the epicenter, because it becomes the country through which dangerous drugs come to the United States. Initially, it was cocaine, then it became heroin, and now the new version of heroin in the case of fentanyl. And these cartels that engage in this activity, no one has had easy solutions to them. In the case of Mexico, for example, the Calderon government in 2006 attempted what they called a mano duro, hard hand approach of basically using the Mexican military to try to wipe out the cartels. That only succeeded in massive homicides in the country, and didn't really stem the tide of the drug flow to the United States. Peña Nieto's government, which came in 2006, tried a different hand. And in all of this, the obviously U.S. officials have been challenged because it does damage to the U.S. society, not so much to Mexican society, as Lopez Obrador pointed out in a meeting with Mexican officials yesterday. Mexico itself does not have a major drug addiction problem. The Mexican population does not have that. It's a transshipment point, and so U.S. and Mexican officials now for a number of years have been working together to try to defeat these cartels, more through prosecutions of their leaders and extraditing them to the United States, where they would wind up staying in jail for the rest of their lives. But no one has a real easy handle on that question in Mexico. But only, I think, a relatively small part of the Mexican migration to the United States can be traced directly to the cartels. Mexicans tend to come to the United States, fewer or more, depending on economic circumstances in Mexico and potential economic opportunities in the United States. Where the cartels, and the word isn't really quite the right one, it's more gangs, are more of a factor in the migration, is Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. There, in the cities of those countries, not the rural areas, migration from the rural areas of those countries is more driven by climate change, but migration from the cities has definitely been augmented and spurred in part by the very, very hard recruitment campaigns that they engage in to bring young boys and young girls into these gangs, and the desire on the part of their parents to avoid that and to come north as whole families, seeking to separate themselves from that gang situation. So it's a part of the migration issue, but it's, again, the numbers have so exploded. Venezuelans, Haitians are now, using the Darien Gap route, and so it is a complex. It is a complex issue. There's no question about that.
Could you talk a little bit about the socialist governments that came into power and some of the corruption that maybe also followed them, and maybe that's part of the failure of some of those socialist movements, that pink tide?
Yeah, the question of corruption is an interesting one, because there is no question that in the context of the political systems in Latin America, the payment of bribes to political officials by well-financed companies and businesses to gain favor for government contracts has been a long-standing thing, and it has implicated over time. There have been implicated governments of both the left and the right. No one has, in a sense, definitively clean hands when it comes to the question of corruption. But as I stated in my talk, in some of the most publicized and dramatic cases of corruption, which Argentina and Brazil were probably two of the best known, they can definitively be said to be trumped up charges, to be charges that basically came from conservative judges allied against the governments of the left, seeking to neutralize political figures that they knew were popular, that they knew could win elections, and to take them out of the picture. And so that involved targeting Cristina Fernandez in Argentina and Inácio da Silva Lula in Brazil. And in neither case was there any truly smoking gun that indicated that they were corrupt individuals. And by corruption, I mean individuals with governmental power who take private money to influence their governmental decisions, awarding of contracts or that kind of thing. They simply were not. And so the theme of corruption tends to have been one that I would argue has been primarily a creation of that conservative control of the media and the judges in the region to tar the legitimate political leaders of the left. There are also charges that have been drawn, even in the United States courts, against Maduro and people close to him in Venezuela. I'm less able to definitively say whether there is or is not something there, but again, I have questions, because I've watched it unfold, particularly in those crucial cases in Argentina and Brazil, where there really were not those charges definitive. And we're now seeing a new one. We're now seeing a new one that has echoes of the United States. Gustavo Petro's son in Colombia is accused of some misdealings of campaign funds in the election of his father to the presidency in 2022. And again, we'll have to see whether there's any true legs to these charges. But again, it's very suspicious because it's coming from political forces in Colombia that were horrified that a left candidate could win there, and willingness to use the levers of the judiciary and the media to tar, in this case, a very popularly elected president through his son. I'm making the comparison here to the way that political forces in the United States, rightly or wrongly, are using Hunter Biden to get at Joseph Biden. So yes, there are definitely cases of corruption that happen in the region, going back decades. But I would not say that was in reality the definitive basis of the downfall of the left. Maybe an election here or there, but then, like in the case of Argentina, when given an opportunity to put a candidate of the left back into power, in spite of the corruption charges, they were willing to do so.
Mm-hmm. And has the progressive movement in Latin America had more or less success than in the U.S.? And what can the U.S. learn from Latin America's experience?
That's an interesting question, one which I don't think I've ever exactly tackled. I think that it's difficult to transport it to the United States in some ways. In the Latin American context, not that there weren't traditional political parties that became discredited, because it has generally been parties that emerged out of mass struggles, labor movement, indigenous movements, Afro-descendant movements. If there is a lesson, yes, it would be that a new political movement, whether it's within the American Democratic Party or independent of it, that's based on popular mobilization and real sentiment from below, is the way to go. That's what ultimately got the political parties of the left, whether it's the movement towards socialism in Bolivia or the citizens movement in Ecuador or the Workers' Party in Brazil. It came very much from that kind of direction. It came from below, but a recognition that social movements alone can't change things. You have to organize a political party, and that political party has to be able to win elections, and to win elections both at the presidential and legislative levels if you are to bring about exact and fundamental change. One might say that an example maybe that had developed in the United States was the movement toward Bernie Sanders within the Democratic Party that almost succeeded in taking over the Democratic Party and making it definitively a move to the left. Whether that would have defeated Donald Trump in the 2016 election, we will never know. But that might have been a little bit of a glimpse of, in the context of U.S. politics, of that, because the Sanders movement was, I would argue, based very much on building off of grassroots struggles that were happening around the country.
Yeah, and a related question is just some of the movement we're seeing around the U.S.'s control of media and judiciary and charges. And what do you think the U.S. is learning from that?
From which the time I missed just the first part of that.
Yep, just so the movement of controlling media and judiciary as a way to promote
Oh,
views.
yeah, I mean, right. I mean, you can very definitely see it um, in the media struggles in the United States. The only thing I would say is, ironically, there is truly more of a level playing field of the media in the U.S. context. In other words, the Latin American context, if you compared it to the United States, would be that if you only had Fox News, that's what that was the only media you had in this country was Fox News. And yet you had a political party, the Democrats, with in a sense no major media in their corner. Obviously, the United States is a more level playing field because you have media, such as MSNBC, that clearly sit within that's mainstream and clearly sit within the Democratic camp. So it's a more balanced situation in the United States. Private media in this country is pretty evenly divided between sympathy for the Democrats and sympathy for the Republicans. Also, the judiciary, it goes both ways. In other words, in the United States, yes, you've seen the judiciary being used by politically conservative forces in the United States to try to push back against what they see as progressive developments that have been engineered by the judiciary that has been appointed by progressive leaders. And so it's there, but the United States situation is a bit different. The Latin American left really faces the reality that it has virtually no allies in the media, though they are trying to develop alternative media such as Telesur out of Venezuela. And on the judicial front, also, over time, they are beginning to move judges into position that they have appointed, who may well, as the future develops, can rule in the favor of programs that progressive governments have put forward. But up until now, it's more been the conservative judges that have thwarted the efforts of progressive political parties.
So we have a question about El Salvador and having been run by a narrow number of families, wealthy families, and the cause of crime. And is that still the case in El Salvador, that in essence, a few rich families are controlling things and controlling crime?
Well, it's still probably, I would agree, a country there where the richest families still have, major political say, major weight. The crime and gang situation, however, there really had a certain almost unique character to it, because these particular gangs did not originate organically from Salvadoran society. They were formed in Los Angeles because 500,000 Salvadorans fled to Los Angeles, specifically the Los Angeles area, in the 1980s, in the middle of the Salvadoran Civil War. And many of them did, most didn't, but a few of them got into trouble in the United States with crimes that they were committing as gang members in Los Angeles, and they got deported back to El Salvador. And we basically deported gangs back to El Salvador that then began to take root, especially in San Salvador, the country's major city. And these gangs, they're not a cartel. They're much more petty criminals, if you will, but they definitely did terrorize the urban population of El Salvador. And they created a difficult circumstance for governments of both the left and the right. Originally, the Salvadoran politics stranglehold was exclusively from the right, with those rich families controlling the Arena Party. But then in the election in 2009 and again in 2014, the remnants of the guerrilla fight, the FMLN, took the presidency of the country and a significant role even in the legislative branch. But they tried very hard, if you will, with different techniques to deal with the gang issue, but not ultimately with great success. And so it continued to be a major issue. And so a man who broke from their rank, called Bukele, and ran as a political independent in the 2019 elections, wound up winning the presidency and carrying out, with, I'm sure, the complicity of the richest families in the country, has carried out a kind of Duterte from the Philippines style mano duro against the gangs, which, again, unclear whether in the long term it will pacify the country, but at least in the short term, it has tended to bring the gang issue much more under control. So much so that when Salvadorans try to make cases now in the United States for not being deported back to El Salvador on the grounds of gang violence, U.S. government lawyers are saying, well, the gang problem in Salvador is abating, and we don't necessarily see that as a basis for your continued presence in the United States. But we'll have to see exactly how all of that does in fact unfold. Bukele is just again a very interesting figure, kind of a populist figure who has tried to play both progressive and reactionary stances at the same time.
And we just have a few more minutes, but we've had a couple of questions about Costa Rica and how it has been stable, and just wondering, its limited size, resources, how has it stayed stable through this period?
Yeah, Costa Rica is a kind of exceptional case. It again, it goes back to a revolution that happened in 1948 that resulted in a kind of pacted solution between the armed factions that basically committed Costa Rica to a social democratic welfare state, something that they were able to do in a relatively small country with some good coffee and other revenues. But they committed to building a strong social safety net, a good healthcare system, a good education system, and over the course of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they implemented it. And so Costa Rica, of the countries of Latin America, quickly emerged as the ones with the best health, education, food security, and other issues. And they did so in part because they didn't pursue having a significant armed force. So that meant they weren't spending money on that. But it wasn't just that. It was that they expended the government revenue into a strong governmental presence, something that was largely absent in most of Latin America until the pink tide governments came in recently. And they've been they've been buffeted by the war by the Revolutionary War in Nicaragua, and then exodus of people into Costa Rica from Nicaragua. But they've largely been able to continue their project. They're a big U.S. tourist destination, and so that helps their economy in recent years to continue this social welfare state. parties alternate in power in the country, but pretty much every political party that comes to power, but only a couple of them, know that maintenance of their strong social democratic welfare state is the only way to go. And so they've continued to defy some of the odds in that small country.
Well, Dr. Prevost, thank you so much for this informative presentation. And also thank you, Grayson, for providing behind the scenes support today. We hope to see you at our next talk, which is scheduled for Friday, October 27th, same time frame, 10 to 11:30 Central Time. And our topic in that session is famine, lack of food worldwide. And we will be hearing from Kanan Soleyapan, who will be speaking on that topic. So thank you all for being here. I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone's questions, but this has been a terrific engaged audience, and we look forward to seeing you in our next one. Thank you so much.